For London, the most serious direct impact from climate change is going to be flooding, not from the Thames, because the Thames barrier behind me does an excellent job of protecting it from flooding, in some ways maybe too good, as we'll see later on in the video. There's another type of flooding. It's difficult to predict when it's going to happen. You can't really warn people about it, and there's very little you can do to stop it once it's started. We're going to see that later on in the video, the most serious type of flooding. But first of all, we're going to start off with the Thames barrier, because previously I made a video about sea level rise, about how Portsmouth, a city on the south coast of England, is doomed to be lost to sea level rise in a century or 2 centuries' time. I said then there are cities all the way around the world that are going to be destroyed by rising sea levels, and I included in them London. Since then, I've found out that if you're London, the capital city of the United Kingdom, responsible for 1/4 of the gross domestic product of Britain, they will do everything they need to keep it safe. There are people already thinking about protecting London from 5 metres of sea level rise. An innovative, adaptable plan is in place to protect communities and infrastructure in the Thames estuary floodplain through to the end of the 21st century and beyond, which can cope with as much as 5 metres of sea level rise and maybe even more. How will they do that? They will permanently dam up the Thames, maybe in 200 or 300 years' time. First of all, we're going to look at the Thames barrier and just see, if you're an important city, how much money people are prepared to spend protecting you from sea level rise. The barrier behind me, the Thames barrier, wasn't built to protect London from sea level rise, but from storm surges. These great storms, they come across the Atlantic, they go across the north of Britain and then south down into the North Sea. These great storms, the wind blows on the surface of the sea, it pushes the water up against the coast of the east coast of Britain and the Netherlands, causing the sea water to rise up. There's a choke point at the English Channel. Again, the waters build up against it, and also the southern half of the North Sea gets to be more shallow. So these great storms, they cause what's called storm surges, these temporary increases in sea level. In 1953, there was a great storm. It rose the sea level so much in the North Sea that 1,800 people drowned in the Netherlands, 300 people drowned in the east coast of England. The storm surge at that time was about 2 metres just at the mouth of the estuary of the Thames. Politicians realised London was vulnerable, so they built this barrier. It took about 30 years, so the storm was in 1953. It took 20 years of thinking about how to respond, and then 10 years to build the barrier. But they did not build the barrier because the scientists warned them that London was at risk. The politicians built a barrier because they could see it was at risk. Okay, so that's an important lesson for climate change. The trouble with London is it's built on a sea level valley. And I can show you that because somebody has helpfully drawn on the side of this tunnel that runs along by the side of the barrier. They have drawn the heights of the Thames for its entire length. So it gets a bit steeper back there. If we start off at the beginning, here is the height of the Thames at the estuary compared to what's called the Ordnance Datum Newlyn. In Britain, the gold standard for maps are the Ordnance Survey maps, and they always measure heights from the nearest lowest low tide. Well, if you're measuring the whole length of the Thames, or any over any large area, the Thames is tidal for the first 60 miles. So every couple of miles, because the Ordnance Survey does such good maps, every couple of miles they reassess the lowest low tide. You can't measure a river hundreds of miles long by measuring its height, by adjusting its height all the way along. So in these cases they use what's called the Ordnance Datum Newlyn, and that is the height measured at an arbitrary location in the southwest of England called Newlyn. Okay, so at the very beginning, at this scale, every centimetre represents about 2 metres. The mouth of the Thames estuary is about 3 metres above this arbitrary measuring point in the southwest of England. So remember that. The Thames starts off 3 metres above the Newlyn data point. And then it carries on, and we gradually make our way up the Thames towards London, the Isle of Sheppey, Sheerness, Southend-on-Sea. Can you see that red line? How flat it is. It hasn't really gone up very much, has it? Thames Haven, Gravesend, Tilbury. That's where I made my video about the end of civilization. We go on further and further up the Thames. Then we get to Silvertown. That's where we are now, where the barrier is. Then we get to central London. Central London is still flat, it's still tidal at this stage until we get to Teddington. So now we're 100 kilometres, 60 miles up the River Thames estuary. We started off at 3 metres above the arbitrary measuring point at Newlyn. Now we're at 3.8 metres. We've come up 100 kilometres from the mouth of the estuary, 60 miles. The Thames has only gone up by 0.8 metres, it's about 3 feet. So London is effectively built on a sea level valley, and it makes it very vulnerable to storm surges. Well, this is fine, but to understand what's going to happen with sea level rise, we need to carefully measure the barrier to see how much sea level rise it can cope with as it is at the moment. So I've already measured up. The Port of London Authority tells me that at the lowest low tide, the water level here is 3.3 metres below. If I can lean over suddenly, we're at low tide now. It's at 3.3 metres below the Newlyn data point, the arbitrary point in southwest England. And the top of the barriers is 7.2 metres above the Newlyn data point. So that means at the lowest low tide, there are about 10.5 metres of river wall, at least on this side of the barrier. There are 10.5 metres of river wall above the lowest low tide. Looking at the tide table for 2025 for this part of the Thames, it looks as though the highest high tide is about 7.5 metres. So at highest high tide, without a storm surge, there should be 3 metres of river wall left at the barrier, which means you can have a storm surge of 2 metres. There'll still be 1 metre of river wall, 1 metre of barrier left. So on the highest high tide of the year, there's still 3 metres of river wall left to protect London. On the other side of the barrier, but there's only 1 metres. You can see on this diagram, this black line that goes along the top shows the height of the river protection, and that blue coloured in area shows the highest you could reasonably expect the river to get to in a really severe storm. That was so severe that it only happened once every 10,000 years. If you're London, responsible for 1/4 of Britain's gross domestic product, they will really protect you. The barrier's at Silvertown, so you can see on the seaward side of the barrier, you can see you get 3 metres of protection, and on the city side, inside the area that the barrier protects, you only get 1 metre of protection. The river wall going through London is only 1 metres above the highest high tide. In 100 years' time, if sea levels have gone up by 1 metre, the river will reach the top of the river wall at the highest of high tides on the part of the Thames that's protected by the barrier. There are plans to raise the river wall upstream by 0.5 metre by 2050 and to raise it by another 0.5 metre as sea levels rise, but they don't want to raise it above that. There are lots of bridges upstream, and nobody wants to have a 2 metre wall blocking off the river through the centre of London. It's not just a case of improving the Thames barrier. For centuries to come, the entire Thames wall and flood defences will need to be regularly improved. 330 kilometres of walls and embankments around the Thames estuary and 400 other floodgates, outfalls and pumps will work together in an interconnected way to protect the tidal floodplain of the Thames estuary from flooding. In 100 years' time, they would need to start thinking about closing the barrier, not just to protect London from the occasional storm surge, but to protect it from sea level rise, from the high tides. Well, there are 2 high tides every day and 2 low tides. So you'd have to operate the barrier twice a day, 365 days a year, 700 times a year. Well, the barrier is only designed to be closed 50 times a year. The busiest time it's ever been was they closed it 50 times in a 3-month period. On average, they just close it about 5 times a year. The barrier, designed to cope with storm surges, cannot cope with rising sea levels and regular high tides. There's another reason. Not only is it just not mechanically designed to operate so often, but also it takes quite a long time to close. For example, when they decide they need to close the barrier to protect London from storm surges, it takes 10 minutes to close each gate, but overall it takes an hour and a half to completely close the barrier. That's because they close the gates on the outside first, and they gradually close the gates towards the middle of the Thames, and they close the barrier at low tide. There are people constantly monitoring the weather on the east coast of Britain, looking for storm surges. They measure the rainfall upstream in the Thames catchment area. So it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There are people checking the weather. They decide they need to close the barrier. They close it at low tide, so that you've still got, 10.5 metres of river wall to allow the Thames to flow into. They close it at low tide. 6 hours later, you get to high tide. The barrier does a great job protecting London from the storm surge. Then, when they realise it's safe, they start to open the barrier, and they do that by slightly opening the gates, so there's a gap between the bottom of the gate and the riverbed, and the water starts to equalise on each side, and that takes 5 hours. If you have 2 high tides a day and 2 low tides a day, you get like 6 hours between high tide and low tide. If it takes 5 hours to open the barrier and an hour and a half to close, it would just be constantly working. They wouldn't be able to keep up. When I made the video about sea level rise and how it's going to affect Portsmouth, I got lots of comments saying sea levels aren't really rising, it's just that the south of England is sinking down. Well, they are right. The south of England is sinking down at the rate of 0.42 millimetres a year. But the tide gauges, how they measure the height of the sea, they say sea levels are rising at a rate of 1.87 millimetres a year. So about a quarter of the increase in sea level in this part of the world is down to England sinking, and about 3/4 of it is down to rising sea levels from thermal expansion. As the oceans warm up, the water expands, from the melting of the mountain glaciers, and thirdly by the melting of the world's great ice sheets, the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet. In Portsmouth, the state of the sea defences mean there's a 1 in 200 year chance that you might be flooded. In London, it's 1 in 10,000. And in fact, if you look where we are in the barrier, the river wall is even higher than that. It's even higher than the 1 in 10,000 year chance. That's the barrier now. Now we get into the interesting bit of how they're going to protect London from flooding, even when we have 5 metres of sea level rise in the next 200 or 300 years. Basically, they're going to be constantly replacing the barriers. Every 100 years or every 50 years, there are going to be new barriers being built. They're going to raise the river wall downstream, down towards the estuary mouth, by between about 0.3 and 0.6 of a metre. Upstream, they're going to increase the river wall by 0.5 of a metre. And those things have to be done by about 2050. But in 2035, they're going to try and stop using the Thames barrier quite as often as they do at the moment. On this part of the river, there are people trying to stop too much water getting into London by using the barrier. Further upstream, there are people trying to increase the amount of water coming into London. They're the people responsible for stopping their own towns flooding that are further upstream on the Thames. All the way along the Thames, after you go past Teddington, there are lots of weirs to make sure the water level's maintained at a constant height, so as to make sure boats can use the River Thames all the way through the year. They're going to dredge those parts of the Thames. Also, they're going to increase the size of the sluice gates, so that in the future, when it's thought there'll be 40% more rain, 40% more rain by 2070, they're going to use the Thames to drain their areas. There'll be more water coming down. They'll open these massive sluice gates. Sometimes, if the River Thames is in flood, there's a great rainstorm upstream, massive flooding, great wave of water coming down the Thames, they will close the barrier at low tide to stop this massive flood water coming down the Thames colliding with the high tide coming in. And the busiest time when the barrier's been used, 50 times in 3 months, was only due to river flooding. From 2035, they're going to stop using the barrier to protect London from river flooding, from the the flooded river crashing headlong into a high tide. So 2035, there could be more river flooding in London. Then in 2040, they've got to make a decision about the replacement for this barrier. And it depends on how quickly sea levels are rising. At the moment, it's thought it'd be 0.6 metres. The British government says all the people responsible for sea defences and river defences need to anticipate a 1 metre rise in sea level. See, government's always much more cautious when they're protecting their own people, aren't they? And if you're in an important place by London, you need to be able to cope with a 1.9 metre increase in sea level rise. So that's easy to do. The amount of rain that's going to be here, 40% more in 2070, easy to predict. What's much more difficult is predicting how much the storm surges will increase. Remember, we're talking about the chance of a 1 in 10,000 year storm, but it really is based on tide gauges that have only been measured for like 100 years or less. If you look at this diagram that shows the increase in sea levels for the last 200 years, it's a line that's definitely going up, isn't it? You can imagine for the next 100 years how quickly it might be going up. 0.6 of a metre, maybe ready for 1 metre or 2 metres. If you look at this diagram that shows the height of the storm surges for the last 100 years, it's far from clear. Is it going up? Is it not going up? At one time they thought they'd have to make the new barrier able to cope with 4.2 metres of sea level rise. They now think the impacts of storm surges will be less than they thought, and they only have to be able to cope with 2.7 metres of sea level rise or increased water. So it'd be 1.9 metres sea level rise, because London's an important place. And what's that? 2.7 and 0.8 of a metre of extra storm surge impacts. According to some scientists, storm surges are the most damaging aspect of rising sea levels, and they're very difficult to predict. Typically, assets of high value and or high vulnerability will have a mandate for protection against a return period of a 1,000 or even a 10,000 years, which is what London's got. It's protected from a storm surge so fierce you'd only expect to have it once every 10,000 years. Since the beginning of civilization, typical tide gauge records cover much shorter periods of the order of 30 to 150 years. Even using the current best practice, the uncertainties in the magnitude of very rare, perhaps unprecedented events may be very large. For example, the size of the 90% confidence interval on a 10,000 year return level at Sheerness is around 1.6 metres. So they think there's a 90% chance that the fiercest storm surge you could expect in a 10,000 year period is 1.6 metres. 1953, they had a 2 metre storm surge at Sheerness. But here's the thing, storm surges are the most dangerous, most damaging part of sea level rise. Damage associated with sea level rise is mostly caused by extreme events such as storm surges. Of most concern is the coincidence of a storm surge with high tidal levels leading to extreme sea levels. And in Europe at least, the impacts of climate change are going to come quite fast, and they're going to make a big difference. Historically, a 1 in 100 year coastal floods are projected to increase by a factor of 10. Before the year 2050, in many locations along the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts, and along almost all remaining European coasts by the end of the century under a low emission scenario. By 2050, we should be having a 1 in 100 year storms 10 times as often, so every 10 years, maybe more often than that. That's under low emission scenarios. Anyway, I'm glad wherever the storm surge level is, however big they need to build the barrier, I'm glad it's not my decision. I'm glad the future of London does not depend on my maths. 2040, they decide what size barrier they want to, and by 2070, that should be in operation. By using the barrier less, this is barrier number 1, we'll call this barrier number 1. By using barrier number 1 less, they hope to extend its life. It's under constant maintenance. It costs something like £18 million a year in 2015. According to the Thames Barrier Visitor Centre, it costs £18 million in 2015 to maintain. It's like really maintaining a ship, isn't it? It's in salt water. You want it to be working all the time, or be able to work all the time. So they're going to use it less. They want to carry on using it, maybe in conjunction with the new barrier, which will need to be 2.7 metres higher up to protect it. And then just 50 years later, in 2120, they need another barrier. We'll call that barrier number 3. 2120, deadline for barrier with second set of gates and locks to be operating. Another stage of upgrade to the upstream defences would change the riverside environment too much. Instead, a barrier of locks will be needed to keep out many high tides as well as storm tides, so they start to use the barrier more often, 2120, to protect it from sea level rise. Then we get to the stage where they start thinking about blocking off the Thames altogether. Finally, at a much later date, it may be necessary to convert the barrier to a barrage. A barrage would always be closed, so it would exclude the tide altogether. It would have locks to allow boats and ships to pass through it. So eventually, 200 or 300 years' time, they're going to have to permanently dam up the Thames. While another mobile storm surge barrier might be built at first, ultimately in the long term, with a large sea level rise, roughly 3 metres or more, would involve a fixed barrage, i.e. a dam with pumping of the Thames flow over it. Eventually, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, they're planning to pump the entire River Thames over the top of a barrier. Just sounds incredible, but it is quite doable. For example, at the moment, when the Thames is flowing normally, there might be 70 cubic metres of water passing every second, 70 metric tonnes of water. When there's a flood, the record is something like 370 cubic metres of water a second. By 2070, we could have 40% more rainfall, 40% more water coming down the Thames. That would mean 500 cubic metres of water a second would have to be pumped over the top of the barrier 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, while the river was in flood. It might sound impossible, but the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority West has a pump that's able to pump 5,000 cubic metres of water a second, 10 times as much. So it is possible, but you just have to make sure it works all the time. As future barriers have to be closed more often to counter higher tides, the flow of the Thames might be slowed so much that when it's in flood, it no longer flows quickly enough to clear the river basin. The higher the height of the river, even at low tide, might be so high that the drop of the river is no longer enough for the force of gravity to clear it. So you might have to start pumping it to clear it past the mobile barriers before you get to a barrier that's a permanent dam. While we've been concentrating on sea level rise, we've forgotten all about storm surges. What's interesting is, by the time we get to the year 2250, if sea temperatures continue to increase at the rate they are, at the moment they're increasing by 0.3 of a degree Celsius per decade. That means in 200 years' time, sea temperatures could be 6 or 7 degrees Celsius warmer than they are now. In the summertime, the top sea temperature you can expect around Britain is about 20 degrees Celsius. Add an additional 6 or 7 degrees Celsius, you get to a temperature where hurricanes start to form. If you have hurricanes, you're into a world of storm surges of 8 metres. So, by the year 2250, you could have 3 metres of sea level rise plus 8 metres of storm surge, which makes you think we really are going to need a fixed barrier to hold back all that water. Now we get to the real problem of climate change and how it's going to affect London directly. And it's a completely different type of flooding. The real thing that people worry about when it comes to flooding in London. In November 2023, the Chief Executive of the Environment Agency told the Public Accounts Committee, "What genuinely keeps me awake at night is surface water flooding, flash floods." In July, we saw a tragic incident with 2 deaths in Liverpool. We saw multiple fatalities in the west of Germany last year. We saw 25 fatalities in South Korea. As a society, we need to take this much more seriously. It's difficult to forecast these very intense rain cells, and often we do not have the necessary warning systems. Not like the Thames barrier, is it, where they constantly monitor the weather all the way down the east coast of England, where they monitor the rain in the Thames catchment area. Since he gave the evidence, 200 people have drowned in Spain through flash flooding. It's going to be more of a problem with climate change because, there'll be more evaporation from the soil, from the oceans, from the trees due to the heat. A warmer atmosphere is able to hold more water vapour, and in Britain, and I'm guessing other parts of the world, the winters will be wetter, the summers will be drier, but when it rains, it will really rain because there'll be more water vapour in the atmosphere. Surface water flooding is the main risk to London. This type of flooding happens when heavy rain falls on hard surfaces, overwhelming drainage and sewers. Flash floods are difficult to predict, and they often happen quickly with fast flowing water. They are more likely to happen during intense summer storms, but they can happen all year round. These are very difficult things to predict. London has two main types of sewer system, each with different problems. If heavy rain overwhelms our sewer system, it can have serious impacts. Surface water flooding of buildings and transport routes, toilets and showers backing up with sewage and flooding basements, pollution of rivers and canals with contaminated surface water from roads, release of raw sewage into the Thames. There's over 500,000 homes in London that are at risk of surface water flooding. That's 1 in 8. And you can see in this map, London has the greatest risk of flash floods anywhere in Britain. London is a massive city, is full of hard surfaces that do not let the water drain away. The solution for the Thames flooding is the Thames barrier. The solution for flash floods is green space. As cities go, London is quite a green city. It's 40% green space. The trouble is, London's population is growing, could be 10 million in 10 years' time. There's a great demand for land. If you live in a house that has a front garden and you own a car, you'll want to tarmac over your front garden so you can park your car off the road. And it won't just be your driveway, every house in the road will want to do that. Lots of people want to have decking and patios. And also, lots of people are extending their houses into the back garden. And you can have these beautiful rooms with bifold doors and open plan kitchens and living rooms. They're very nice. It's very lucrative because London houses cost millions. You can improve your house. That's a good thing to do. But all the time, all the green space is being used up. This is called urban creep. The solution they're trying is called SUDS. Here's a map of all the additional green spaces they're trying to add. I've been round to some of these. They are very small. London being a modern city, some of these places have their own web page, so you could look at them. They're very proud of them. But when you get to them, well, one was just a metre square flower bed, and it looked like all the flowers had died. And you think, my God, is London such a desolate place that they celebrate with a web page a square metre of flower bed? And when you look across the road, you can see there are trees, there is green space. So it strikes me, it's a good effort, to try and improve the amount of green space. I'm not sure it's going to make much of a difference. They're not just doing this to try and improve the amount of green space in London. People are being encouraged to have green roofs, where you have plants on the roof of your house to try and absorb the water, or blue roofs, where the water just sits on top of your house in a pool as water, and it slowly drains away, so it slows down the speed that water goes into the sewers. There are other things as well. There is the London Sustainable Drainage Action Plan, and that involves trying to reduce the amount of rain going into the sewers by 25% by getting developers to include more green space and plants on their developments. Also, London is spending millions of pounds improving the sewer network. Its main objective is to reduce the amount of sewage going into the Thames, but there will be some effect on reducing surface water flooding just by increasing the sewer capacity. If you think every year in London there are something like 60,000 planning applications in Britain, if you want to increase the size of your house or do any changes, you need planning permission. About, I think, a third of those requests are all people making changes to their houses, possibly extending into the garden or changing the front garden. So that's 20,000 planning requests every year. A few red dots on the map. Is it going to make much difference? So it's far from clear to me if people are taking this problem seriously of flash flooding. And if you compare it to the London barrier, it looks magnificent. You can close it and protect the whole of London very easily. With this, it's very difficult to forecast where the rain is going to fall. Even if you knew, how would you warn people? And when it's falling, what can you do? How can you significantly change London so it has suddenly a lot more green space? Are you going to make people dig up their front gardens and force them to park their cars on the road, where probably there are other cars parked there already now? So that's the end of the video, really. I'm in Greenwich Park now. If I turn the camera around, there's a nice view over there of the observatory, if you can see that. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.